Hi, in today's video lesson of graphic storytelling, which is telling stories and communicating in comic book form, we're going to talk about two components of doing that: situation and atmosphere. And we'll get to the atmosphere in a little bit. So going back and talking about situation, everybody has probably heard that word, you probably use that word, you think you know what the word means. When it comes to storytelling, we're going to use it in a perhaps slightly different way, or a more complete way, I should say. Usually in conversation, when someone uses the word situation, what they're really talking about is what is happening, what's going on with you, what's happening to you. But we tend to forget that it means much more than what. It actually means who, what, where, how, why, and when. It's actually 6 questions we're asking. We tend to forget that in conversation because usually we know some of the answers already. And so we're usually more concerned about what. So when people say, what's the situation? They really are asking, by and large, what is happening? What are you doing? What's happening to you? What's going on with you or around you? For example, if you had a landline and I called your house and you answered, I know with whom I'm speaking, you. I know where because I dialed the number to your house, and I know when because it's always right now. Unless I found a magic phone that can talk to the past or the future, it's always right now. So we already know some of the answers. If I call you up at home and I say, hey, what's the situation? I know who, where, and when, but I don't know what, and sometimes how and why. So those 6 questions are what you want to think of and be concerned with and be conscious of when you're telling your story and creating your story in comic book form. You want to be able to answer those questions before a reader can say, wait a minute, who is this person? How did they get there? When did that happen? You don't want to confuse the reader, as we've talked about in previous videos. You can do anything in comic books except for confuse or bore the reader. As long as you avoid those 2 things, you get to go hog wild with your storytelling. You get to do anything in any creative way as long as you don't do those 2 things. So we have to avoid confusion, and answering those questions, those 6 questions of situation, before the reader can look at it and go, all right, who are these guys? Wait, how did that happen? You want to be able to tell that with your story, with your drawings, with your compositions and whatnot. We'll talk about that. So it really is 6 questions. Now, to be fair, how and why are similar, and sometimes they'll share the same answer. How something happened and why something happened is not always the same thing, same answer, but a lot of times it can be. So you don't want to forget one or the other, even though sometimes they will be the same. They'll have the same answer. And a lot of times, specifically in comic books, and TV and movies, I suppose, but in comic books, which is what we're talking about, you want to think of establishing, because we talked about establishing shots in the first video. No, the second video, talking about long shots, being also called an establishing shot, because when you bring the camera back and pull back and show from far away, a long shot, you're establishing where. You're not just focusing on the face of the character and you don't know where they are. So you want to establish, every time you cut to a new scene in the story, you need to establish who, what, where, how, why, and when by the end of that page. That scene can go on for any number of pages in the story, but by the end of that first page, if you haven't told me where the characters are, who they are, by showing me presumably, and what's going on around them, at those very least 3 answers, I'm going to get confused and might get a little bit bored. So you don't have to put an establishing shot at the start or the front of the new scene, although many, many times that is how it's done. But very quickly you need to establish, where are they? You need to show somehow that people, without reading a caption, without looking at the dialogue, can look at it and go, oh, I get it. They're in a new place. They're in that new place. They're in that other place. Something else is happening in a new place. And this is who it is. So you really do want to avoid readers being confused, as we've said before, and answering those questions as best you can with your storytelling, with the drawings, is a good way to do that. Of course, it's going to actually make that make that work much better. So that's the idea behind situation. You want to be rather mindful of the idea of fulfilling those questions of situation as you're telling the story. Now, do you have to draw the background into every single panel to just, remind people that he's in the living room, he's in the kitchen, he's in the dungeon, he's in the spaceship, whatever it may be? No, but you can't just draw one establishing panel showing that background and then forget about it. You do need to remind people and kind of pull them along and take them by the hand a little bit in the story. So every couple panels, put in something to remind people like, oh yeah, that's right, there's a okay, yeah, okay, I got it, oh yeah, I know where they're at. Even gentle things like that are seemingly set dressing to the story a little bit, to the scene a little bit, and simple and almost in an unobtrusive way, just kind of remind the readers where they are, why, how, when, what's going on, and so forth. So now let's move on to the next component of storytelling in this video, called atmosphere. And atmosphere is just a fancy way of saying the mood, the overall feeling. What was it like in that scene, in that part of the story? And you can have happy, sad, scary, exhilarating, dreary, whatever the mood of that scene is. There's ways to do that in comic books. A lot of times they're somewhat stereotypical in cartoons, especially when you see a character who's depressed or sad, you see a rain cloud over their head. In a comic book, you may not necessarily show a cartoony rain cloud over their head, but you might be a rainy day. It's a very dreary day, and they're walking alone in the rain on the wet streets, on the sidewalks. So depending on what the mood or atmosphere is, will typically dictate how you show that. Now, how can you do that? You can do it with the setting. If you're trying to, show a particular mood, set it in a place that will convey and imply that mood, presumably, as well as what the characters are doing or what's happening to them. To some extent, you can use sound effects, the actual lettering of sound effects, how they're lettered, what the sound is, what the actual rendition of the way, the idiosyncratic way that you're doing the lettering can also imply. Mood, lighting or lack thereof, but the lighting can, a lot of times, dramatic lighting can convey a mood. Staging elements, which is to say just details that go in to the setting. Don't just show the setting like, oh, this is a place, but have things that also emphasize that go along with that idea. I'm going to give an example in a minute. Camera angles. How you actually show the story from what angles sometimes can actually also be used. We talked about tilt in a previous video when we talked about camera angles. If you go back and look for that video, the tilt or Dutch angle a lot of times can convey that idea of something being rather unnatural or unusual, if that's what the setting, or if that's the mood or atmosphere you're trying to convey. And then there's another one that's kind of in a special category because it can overlap into other ideas, but the idea of silhouette. So let's go real quickly. I'll come back to silhouette, but real quickly, let's go and talk about an example of trying to convey atmosphere or mood and using those different ways of doing it. Now, I'm going to talk about a scary setting as opposed to happy or, running around or exhilarating. So in scary movies, even if you don't like scary movies, you have an idea of what scary movies are about, even if you don't care for them. You'll notice that typically in the scary movie, when it takes place in the haunted house or the castle or the graveyard, they're using a setting that's, again, almost implying, this gothic setting is implying something scary, something unusual, something not normal is going to happen. So picking a gothic setting for a scary movie, or scary, excuse me, not scary movie, but a scary story, makes sense because people go, oh, okay, yeah. There are exceptions to that. Richard Matheson was the master of this. He would actually kind of brought back the idea almost single-handedly in American literature that horror stories do not have to exclusively take place in haunted houses, in deserted castles and graveyards and spooky places like that. It could be in the house next door. Stephen King obviously has taken this idea and pushed the envelope even further. But taking that you can actually have horror anywhere and everywhere is a little bit scarier. But stereotypically, horror will take place in that scary setting. So if you want to actually have people get it right away, you can put it in a creepy setting if that's your idea, if that's your story. So that's the setting. So lighting, you notice that in scary movies, it doesn't usually take place, again, there's exceptions, usually doesn't take place out in the middle of a sunny field on a bright summer day. Less likely than in a dark, scary dungeon or a haunted house or something to that effect. And lighting, so lack of lighting, and also not showing the monster, is better because less is more, and we'll talk about that as well. So then staging elements. If I want to show a scary story in my comic book and it takes place in a place that's scary, I'm going to pick a haunted house, but also there's going to be cobwebs. There's going to be a skull on the bookshelf. There's going to be, candelabra with the candles burnt down and a spooky clock. And all these again, very traditional, almost cliched elements would be part of staging elements. Camera angles, shooting it from odd camera angles can kind of keep the viewer off balance, keep them, from feeling stabilized. You can jump around a little bit and show these very odd, almost voyeuristic angles that can sort of creep them out a little bit. And then we're coming to that special category of silhouette. Silhouette means to have the shape or the contour of the shape and then have it filled with a solid color. So you know what this is. Imagine if you were in a room and the lights were off and it was dark, but your door is open and the hallway is lit and someone stands in the doorway to the room. They're being lit from behind in the hallway, and you won't be able to see their features, but you would be able to see the dark outline filled in. You'd be able to tell it was a person, but just not the details of the person. So that's an example of silhouette, perhaps. Silhouette is kind of a special category because it isn't just about being scared, although you can use it that way. Silhouette is kind of a scary or mysterious, or it could be just a slick graphic element, depending on how you're using it. So it can be part of atmosphere, but it can also be used in other ways as well. So that's why it's a special category, in my opinion. So if you want to show something that's rather intimidating and scary and kind of overbearing, don't show the details, put it in silhouette. If you want to have something that's not necessarily scary, but more mysterious, it's more of a detective story. The detective sees the figure in silhouette and says, we have to find out who that is. Let's go chase them. Let's go discover what that means. That's more of a mysterious silhouette than not necessarily scary or intimidating or horrific. And then the third one is just using silhouette as part of the drawing, just as a graphic element. It just might read better against a different background to have a silhouette or have it all black and a white silhouette, or if you're working in color, whatever color you're using, depending on that. So you can use silhouette in atmosphere, in the mood, but not necessarily. It could actually convey other ideas as well. Going back to silhouette and also lighting to sometimes, and I talk about the example of a scary story. It could be any kind of story. I'm just using this one. And we'll talk about this a little bit in other videos, presumably. But less is more. If you're trying to scare the audience in a movie, in a TV show, in a comic book, in a book, well, not a book, but in a comic book, don't show all the details. Keep it silhouetted. Keep the lighting dim. Keep a lot of shadows in there. Keep it poorly lit. Less is more. Why? Because what does the phrase "less is more" mean? That's what I'm going to talk about. What scares me doesn't scare you, and what scares you doesn't scare her, and what scares her doesn't scare him. Everybody's going to think of something that scares them when they see the silhouette of the creature standing there. So if we did a horror comic and you showed the monster jump out and you actually showed it and it looked kind of goofy and kind of silly, people would be like, "Pfft, I'm not scared. That was stupid. That didn't look scary." But if you don't show it, then people are going to be like, "Oh, I bet it looks really creepy. Ooh, I'm getting creeped out. Ooh, I bet it's just scary." They're going to think of what scares them. And that's going to be different for everybody. So instead of showing something that you think scares you and expecting it to scare everyone else, and again, I'm using a scary story, it could be any kind of story element, don't expect that to work for everybody. Here's an example. I know some people out there may not have seen this movie, and if you're a young person, you don't need to see this movie yet, but it's considered a classic. Hitchcock's Psycho. There is a scene, the shower scene, the infamous shower scene. If you were to go back and watch that film, you'll realize at no point did they show violence. It was entirely implied. There was no stabbing. You showed the knife, you showed the curtain, and you showed blood going down the drain. Everything else was in your mind. Everything else that you went, "Oh my gosh, that was so horrible. Oh, I can't believe that happened." That was all taking place in your mind. He actually showed you much less. He gave you much less information and got a bigger reaction. Less is more. He actually was able to scare and creep out the audience by giving them less information. So that's an example of that. So you can actually use that in your atmosphere, in your setting, not setting, in your mood, trying to show something that's happy, sad, scary, exciting, whatever the setting should be for the story is fine. You need to find a way to use these parts to convey that, as opposed to having to tell the story. You want to show the story. You want people to look at it and feel like they understand what's going on. And part of that is because as human beings, this is me just getting off on a tangent, I suppose. As human beings, we're still kind of scared of the dark. We still, have that age-old animal instinct of, there's something out there, and I'm scared of what's out there. There was a time when there were things that roamed the earth that were much bigger than us, that would just scoop us up out of our trees and eat us. So we have that instinct of the darkness. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what's in the dark, and we're scared of it. There's probably nothing in the dark nowadays that we haven't already seen on Animal Planet, but we still have that instinct, and we can trade upon that instinct in our storytelling, that the viewer is going to have that instinct, and we can actually use that to our advantage while trying to get our ideas across. So those are the two elements I was talking about, not elements, but components of situation and atmosphere in graphic storytelling. Again, if people have comments, if you have questions, feel free to leave them. If you need to message me with specific questions, that'd be fine too. I hope everybody's staying safe and everybody's doing well, and hopefully this will all be over soon and we'll get back to normal and have fun. But even while it's on, while we're in place, everybody should be having fun and being productive as best you can, and hopefully we'll see each other soon.